All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to Mr. Withers' excellent presentation. And what I want to do is just kind of introduce everybody in the program. This event is being put on by the Gaston College Scholars of Global Distinction Program, the Global Education Team, the Multicultural Affairs Committee, and the Bob Blanton Study Tours at Gaston College program. Our goal is to inspire global confidence and cultural awareness amongst our students. We encourage travel, we encourage diversity, we encourage inquiry in these areas. And so if you're interested in travel, the Bob Blanton Study Tours program is traveling to Morocco in May of 2022. And information for that event can be found, or that tour can be found under your Student Resources tab on the Gaston College homepage under Study Tours, or you can email Mr. Blanton at blanton.bob@gaston.edu for more information. The Scholars of Global Distinction program is a program for our students that has a tie-in with UNC Chapel Hill. Students who complete our program, attending 8 events such as these, completing a intercultural competency part and taking courses that have a global component to them will achieve Scholar of Global Distinction. They'll have recognition on their transcript as well as a certificate of completion from UNC Chapel Hill and Gaston College. You can talk to a number of instructors, myself, Mr. Withers, Judith Porter, Michelle Dominich, Chris Thurley, for more information about that, or you can find the program on the Gaston College homepage. Without me talking anymore, I'm going to go ahead and turn over the presentation to Mr. Withers. So enjoy yourself, and go ahead, John. It's all yours.
All right, ni hao. Thank you for joining us today. It's been a while since I've Zoomed. We all jumped into the Zoom world last year fairly aggressively, but I've not Zoomed all semester. So bear with me as I juggle a few screens and click a few buttons. Today, we're going to be talking about Chinese and Taiwanese glove puppetry. As we were talking in the kind of the pre-meeting session, I'm not going to make a very big distinction between Chinese and Taiwanese puppetry in this moment. I'm kind of explaining why. There is a rich geopolitical divide between Chinese and Taiwanese, and that may be something that you want to explore, why those are not synonyms, in another lecture somewhere else. But for the matter of puppetry at hand, Chinese and Taiwanese are going to be nearly synonymous for me because of their puppetry roots. Okay, so we're going to talk glove puppetry particularly. Glove puppetry is like the Sesame Street that you may all know. So before I get into the matter at hand with the Chinese and Taiwanese puppetry, I want to talk a little bit about my own puppetry background, my own kind of puppetry loves. You need to understand the kind of experience I have with puppetry as a spectator, and then the expertise I bring as someone, but also the blind spots that I may have as someone that's talking about in international puppetry. So like many Americans, my love of puppetry goes all the way back to the Muppets, to Sesame Street, to Mr. Rogers, to the great glove puppets that Jim Henson Studios and others put on television, particularly PBS, or maybe some special feature movies like Muppets Take Manhattan, the Runaway Big Bird movie, that kind of classic puppets that I grew up on. Somewhere along the line, though, I felt like I'd seen enough Sesame Street and had seen all of the Muppet movies by either Disney or the Jim Henson Studio, all the Labyrinth, Dark Crystal, all the American puppet movies that way. And I found British puppetry, especially the Jerry Anderson, the Supermationation, the marionette puppets for action movies. In the 60s and 70s, Gary Anderson was doing marionettes and then rod puppets, filming them in a different way and doing action television with them. High impact, high explosion, action television. Lots of fun stuff. Those have also been fairly popular on cable television for the past 30 years in America. They get reran late night. They're easy to find. They've got some American spin-off kind of homages like Team America World Police, which is big in the early 2000s. And then looking at the Supermationation, looking at that action-oriented puppetry, I've eventually found the puppetry of South Africa, where they were taking this British idea and trying to make a South African TV show. There's some Japanese counterparts where they took this British Jerry Anderson and made that same style for Japanese shows like Bomber X or Starfleet, depending on which DVD you buy and what they decide to translate that as. So that's my puppetry background as a spectator, as someone that loves puppetry, but can barely get past sock puppets and I can't make marionettes dance at all. That's just my puppetry background, my puppetry credentials as a literary scholar, I suppose. That's my vantage point and probably some of my blind spots. In 2019, during the summer, I taught at a university in Xi'an, the Shaanxi province in China. Xi'an historically was the original heart of the empire. That's the original capital. When they built the Great Wall, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, they built a similar wall at the same time period around Xi'an, so that if all of the empire fell, they could protect the capital. And the university I was teaching at was just a few blocks away from the old city, the original square, so I could go to that wall and didn't need to take a train ride all day to the northern wall, because I had one I could bicycle around and explore. So here on the left, you'll see me in front of the Terracotta Army as it's being excavated, and archaeological dig is still going on. It's still an active archaeology site, but they allow visitors in like a museum. So I got to spend time there for a day. Also spent time in front of the drum tower and the bell tower in the heart of the city, which is the picture to the right is me playing tourist in Xi'an. By the time I made it to Xi'an, I was already aware of Asian puppetry, already aware of the history of puppetry internationally, and I actively sought out some puppetry while I was there, and was able to find some, which is good. So I can relate that experience too in just a few minutes. But before we get into the Chinese or Taiwanese glove puppetry specifically, I do want to talk about the history of puppetry in general. The history of puppetry is an Eastern tradition, but it mirrors the Western tradition of drama. So nearly on kind of a big grand scale, at nearly the same point in time when Thespius is stepping out of the Greek chorus and becoming the first thespian to take on a role and birthing what we regard in the Western tradition as the birth of drama and plays. At that same time in the Eastern tradition, they were doing puppetry, where the Greeks had that chorus line to celebrate religious and social and educational experiences. The Eastern tradition had the same sort of religious, social, and educational venues and stories for puppets. And so where the Greeks took to the stage with live actors, the Eastern world took to puppetry stages with much different actors. There were a few limitations in the early Greek plays. If you study the Greek dramas, you'll realize there's only ever 3 actors on stage at any given time. There's usually a chorus that sings responses and does other parts. There's only ever 3 actors on stage at any one given time. Those actors had giant wooden heads on that function as megaphones, so they could be heard in the back row. And they were always on raised platform shoes, so they were nearly 2 to 3 foot higher than normal, and had on giant robes. So those actors had very limited motion. The original staging of the Greek dramas also could not have detailed sets or props. It was very much a spoken word presentation. By the time the Romans get involved, they fix a lot of technical concerns. But I want to point out that the limits of the Greek drama were very real and very present. It takes until the Roman Empire to figure out how to get props and set changes and pieces that look more like the theater that you would know if you went to a local theater live performance. Puppetry did not have those same limitations. The Eastern tradition of using puppetry allowed them to be able to swap multiple characters, have all kinds of fantastic props, dragons, and a lot more interesting pieces to their storytelling, perhaps. And the Eastern tradition is going to take part along the Silk Road, which again is a much longer discussion on exactly why the Silk Road moves. And I encourage everyone to find a geopolitical history major and start questioning the Silk Road, because it is fascinating from a historical standpoint, and the culture that moves along the Silk Road as they're using this as a primary trading route from one side of China all the way back to Greece is an amazing intersection of ideas. a lot of ideas that probably originate in the Hindi or the Urdu regions of modern day India, get spread all the way to the Greek, and some Greek mathematicians start using concepts from the Hindi people, but also this idea of information traveling further to the coast in the Chinese direction and through that empire. There's a lot of art, there's a lot of culture, there's a lot of history that kind of intertwines. That's really the main reason that I'm not going to make a big distinction between Chinese and Taiwanese puppetry, is because that puppetry style may or may not have originated in China or Taiwan or India, but because of the Silk Road, the puppetry styles kind of mix regions together. You can find plenty of experts that will promise you that they are experts and that all of this starts in China. You can also find plenty of experts that claim they've got evidence that all of this starts in India or Taiwan or every point in between. The distinction of exactly where this starts culturally is very blurred, and a matter of much debate between puppetry experts and puppetry scholars and literary people. Aren't going to take time to sort that out unless that's the entire focus of an hour. But I do want to highlight a few of the styles that are being shared along the Silk Road. The primary style would be the shadow puppetry. Most puppet experts and puppet historians will place shadow puppetry as one of the oldest forms of puppetry, popular along the entire route of the Silk Road. This is still being practiced in China today as a little niche tourism thing. I was actually able to see some shadow puppets while I was in Xi'an in the old city. I was in a museum and they were doing hourly shadow puppet shows, and that was amazing. The left-hand side of the screen here, you should see the puppets themselves, which are these thin material characters being controlled by sticks. The sticks can vary in lengths. And as you see on the right is the look of what the audience sees in a puppet show that's done with shadow puppetry. There's always a light behind the puppet, so the shadow is on the screen. That shadow can be colored because if the material is thin enough and the light of the material, the wood, the bamboo, the silk screens, that color can be actually transmitted to the screen. So you get color variations, you get high contrast details. You also get dragons and rabbits and houses popping up and going away fairly quickly. So you get a lot more variety in story and storytelling in the shadow puppets, but you're still the same basic reasons that the Greeks were telling stories: educational purposes, cultural purposes, religious purposes, celebrations. The core of what they're telling in stories is very similar, even though the Eastern tradition has a lot more tools to play with, because puppetry gives them a lot more variety in props and settings and movements and locations. And in some ways, it's the superior theater, even though the Western tradition is just sure the Greeks are great. So the shadow puppetry is a vibrant and live piece of puppetry, but also the glove puppetry. Glove puppetry is familiar to any Muppets fans. I like the picture here on the left because you see Ernie, a nice classic Muppet, and how it takes two people to manipulate Ernie from underneath. Ernie is a little bit more complicated than a Mr. Rogers sock puppet, which is also a type of glove puppet. You've got one puppeteer moving the dominant hand. You've got one puppeteer, that same puppeteer usually is controlling the mouth. And so the dominant hand of the mouth is one puppeteer, and you've got a second puppeteer moving the offhand, your offhand remarks. So you've got your offhand movements, and it's coordinated underneath the sets. And that's the way American glove puppetry tends to look until we kind of build for movie sets or television sets like Sesame Street or a Muppet movie. We build sets so that we kind of cheat the heights of the Muppets and the locations of actors. And it's a beautiful backstage. If you've never looked at how they make a Sesame Street episode, it's fascinating. Glove puppetry in China, Taiwan, is very similar, where you may have one or two puppeteers underneath the puppet. If you'll look there at the right, you'll see kind of the traditional Chinese, Taiwanese glove puppet. It's a little bit more porcelain, a little bit more exact, not quite as felty and fuzzy as the Muppets that we know. A lot more ability to do realism that way because they have that capability, and they have bodies that look very real. Chinese puppetry is not a dominant art form in China right now. There are museums and theaters all over China that showcase Chinese puppetry so that it can be preserved and it can be shown as a cultural icon of China. In Taiwan, this is where we made start to make a distinction between Chinese and Taiwanese. In Taiwan, there is still an ongoing puppetry as a piece of modern media. That's where the Pili troupe comes in. The Pili troupe is a specific group of puppeteers that have been together for quite a long time, and they have made the transition from live puppetry in a theater to televised puppetry, to movie puppetry, to YouTube puppetry. And Pili has kind of a long ongoing history of puppetry, and as a modern piece of media that is still enjoyed by the Taiwanese public today. Of course, all tastes are subjective, and it comes and goes in and out of fashion, but it is a long-running television show, long-running movie franchise. It is a long-running set of puppetry. The easiest entry point into Pili puppetry for Americans is probably Thunderbolt Fantasy. You'll see that graphic here. Thunderbolt Fantasy is not truly completely a Taiwanese puppet show. It is the Taiwanese puppeteers, and the story is based on Taiwanese stories that they have told before, but an anime and mangaka author from Japan has come in and rewrote the stories, and then the Thunderbolt Fantasy is actually a collaboration between some Japanese animation studios and the Pili International Media Corporation. So Thunderbolt Fantasy winds up having the easiest access point for Americans because we can go to Crunchyroll or most anime viewing websites and find it. It's also available on Netflix for those of you who like to stream on Netflix. You can have easy access to Thunderbolt Fantasy, either subbed or dubbed, and fairly high quality, and it's easy to find. Slightly harder to find, but still a fairly nice entry point for Americans, is the Pili War of Dragons. War of Dragons is another story arc from the Pili puppeteers, but this one has not been manipulated by the Japanese for the Japanese market or for the American market too directly. So it's a retelling of some older stories that they had televised earlier on, and they wanted to kind of revamp them, use a little bit more of the new storytelling methods that they've adopted in the modern media sphere, and they went back and they're kind of retelling some of their old stories all over again. But it's still a very Taiwanese production. Now, to look at Thunderbolt Fantasy or Pili War of Dragons, when you're looking at them, a couple key things you need to kind of keep in mind as you enter them. They're in a Wulan fantasy setting. That is a kind of stock Chinese Asian fantasy setting. It does look very visually distinct from European fantasy like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, but at its core, it's very similar. So it's modern creators going back to an idealized history point like the 14th century, the 17th century, and then adding a little bit more magic, a few more magical swords, a lot more ongoing quest stories. And so any fantasy lover from Lord of the Rings through Game of Thrones to Wheel of Time can usually find something in Thunderbolt Fantasy and Pili War of Dragons that they kind of recognize. Ongoing quests, magic swords, chosen ones, kind of that iconography might be a little bit different, but the literary themes are fairly similar. Now, Thunderbolt Fantasy is a nice entry point because it tells one ongoing story that goes on for 3 seasons and 2 OVA movies. The Pili War of Dragons is one piece of a much larger story. That's a story that's been going on since the television days, then on through modern media. So it's kind of a piece of a larger whole, and can be a little bit harder to grab some of the subtleties because they're making references to an episode 20 years ago that's not on Netflix, which is slightly frustrating at times. Then also when you're looking at these puppets, pay attention to the artwork, the camera angles, the way they frame action, the way they're using miniature sets. Like the Muppets, they're using a lot of the kind of miniatures and camera angles to make the puppets themselves look as real as possible. They are adding CGI flourishes in the modern the modern presentations, and they're adding a little bit of sound effects to help source that out. But there's a lot that they're doing here that looks very modern, very hip, very slick. But at its core, it's still the way the puppetry would have been presented 100 years ago, but just with a few new tools added to the glove puppetry mix. So I want to stop the slideshow just for a second and switch screens. Hopefully that screen switches for y'all as well. And I want to look at a opening scene, about 6 minutes or so, from episode 1, scene 1 of Thunderbolt Fantasy. It's a nice kind of introduction to what this looks like, more than me just trying to describe glove puppetry to you with some still images. I wanted to look at how the camera work looks all together. So let's take a look at this for a few moments.
John, we only see your email, so go back and switch. You have to stop the share.
Let me reswitch that. Thank you, Brian. That fix it? Nope, because I hit the button. There we go.
There you go.
There we go. Hitting all the buttons.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Brian.
題名先行天地揺るがす轟を鳴り物に物語は幕を開ける晴天にあって霹靂を聞くかのごとき驚天動地の幻想奇譚
走れ大飛走れ兄上おい逃げた小娘が元気衆に立てついた愚を思い知れさせるか古のご因子の剣がこの程度の軽さとは笑わせぬ短家の技を侮るかゲロ短気献血非可行月避けたか
And so I'll stop on this image for a moment and remind you this is a 1.5 foot glove puppet on someone's hand at this point. You've got two puppeteers working these two puppets independently. You've got then a lot of camera tricks for like extreme close-ups to show the feet, to show the swords, to show the action, to kind of make it look as smooth and fluid as possible. But under all the camera angles and under all of the CGI flourishes and sound effects, you still have a really nice presentation of Taiwanese puppetry. You can watch a series like this, Pili War of the Dragons or this Thunderbolt Fantasy, and see how the stories are told in Taiwanese puppetry, how they're using the miniatures, the sets, and especially in a very movie-oriented, television-oriented fashion. And when we're going through here, looking at the way the close-ups work, or looking at how the mixture of CGI and practical sets are mixed together so that the camera can seem to fly through, kind of a mixture of CGI environment and physical environment to get us to a mix of practical props and fog. It's really highly detailed movie making, but at the core, there's still that story and what the story looks like in a Taiwanese, especially if you look at Pili War of Dragons, available on Netflix and YouTube and some other places. You really get a look at what that story is going to look like and how that story unfolds episode by episode. Action scenes are fun, and I think probably show off the possibilities the best, but there's lots of character moments, lots of getting to know how this large cast interacts with each other in various ways, various personalities. And it's, like any long-going fantasy television show that you've ever watched and enjoyed, just with glove puppets. So we'll stop that share one more time. Let you see me again just for the moment. Let's switch back. All right, now we'll go back to the slideshow just for a second. Screen, yep, okay. So looking at Pili behind the scenes, what we just saw in Thunderbolt Fantasy is the same way they've been doing this for quite a while now. So we can see kind of the scale perspective there in that first picture with the hand and the puppeteers, the fog machines, the models on a table, and the movement of the main puppets themselves before they start going back and doing close-ups. Also in the middle there, you can see kind of some fairly simplistic camera gear to control lighting, control perspective and shots. When you can control the entire world at once, you don't need as big of dollies and crane shots because you can move the model and move cameras in pretty dependable ways. And then just a nice shot of the model itself that winds up being a set for this. And Pili was able to make the move that some other glove puppetry companies couldn't. They were able to move from touring show to a theater show in Taiwan. They also had a successful television show. At one point in the Taiwanese Chinese history, the television network was actually shut down by the Chinese government because they wanted to control the Taiwanese airwaves. As again, as I pointed out, that's a complex history that they share. And so Pili was so forward thinking that they started recording VCDs, videos on demand, and renting those at gas stations so that you could keep up with the ongoing story even when they didn't have access to television waves. And they were able to make enough money on rental markets that they actually bought their own television studio at one point, so they could have their own pirate broadcast television studio of this puppetry and onto the Taiwanese televisions. And they've stayed up with the time in interesting and novel ways that some of their rivals did not. For Americans trying to learn more about Pili or Taiwanese puppetry in general, these are Thunderbolt Fantasy and then the War of Dragons is probably the two best entry points. Chinese and Taiwanese properties sometimes come into America on Netflix or YouTube. Sometimes they're subbed or dubbed for American audiences. In the case of Pili, when you start looking into it, you realize there's a lot more information in Chinese than there is in English. There's a lot more fan sites, a lot more Twitter feeds, a lot more information just available in general if you know a little Chinese. When you take their official English Twitter and you realize it's not putting up all the messages that their Taiwanese Twitter is, or if you look at their YouTube videos that have English subtitles are not representative of the entirety of their long history, nearly 30-year film history. You realize that American audiences don't have quite the full access to Pili that you would if you were in Asia. And you also realize that have to realize that Pili is only one of several large puppet show producers in Taiwan, but they're probably the biggest and the best exported, which is why I'm highlighting them there. Pili did do a lot of business, as I mentioned a moment ago, on VCDs. VCDs never really caught on in America. They were an option, but we were moving toward DVDs too quickly. And so in the format wars between VHS and DVD, VCD didn't make a very big American impact. VCDs were very popular in Asia. For a long time, VCDs were more popular in Asia than DVDs were for a variety of technology reasons. And so there's a lot of Pili War of the Dragons style puppet shows that have been placed on VCD. Almost none of those have subtitles in English. So if you know Chinese or can read some Chinese subtitles, those are helpful. Or if you want to take time to track down a few of those VCDs and just sort of appreciate what it looks like without knowing what's happening necessarily in the story, those are helpful. But to really get the full impact of what story is being told, how is that story taking place over years and over multiple seasons and from one creator to the next, how is this character really moving in the story. That's something that we don't have a lot of access to beyond the Netflix 2 shows and some YouTube and Twitter pieces that they are trying to export into America. There have been some other attempts to bring it to the Western audience. I will caution you to never watch the Wulan Warriors. That was in the early 2000s. I believe it was 2006. There were 13 episodes made and re-edited for the Cartoon Network. The Cartoon Network took a couple years worth of story from the Taiwanese story, re-edited it, and then overdubbed it in English to make a new story. They took characters that were mute and did not speak and gave them dialogue. And then mostly that dialogue was fart jokes, and it made almost a Ninja Turtles kind of humor, like early Ninja Turtles kind of humor, kind of laid over top, and really ruins the story, the storytelling, and really kind of the Wulan Warriors winds up being the low point. The actual story that was told there was a couple year epic story arc, was great, but it's hard to have access to that in America. So if you ever start looking at Thunderbolt Fantasy and Pili War of Dragons, that's great. If you ever find Wulan Warriors, the Cartoon Network edit, just delete that and move on. It is not a good entry point into what this looks like by any means. And so our limited time today, I do want to make sure we're emphasizing that when Americans are looking for this type of puppetry, Netflix is the best place to start, because Pili has been able to put a few of their shows on Netflix. There have been some other DVDs and other attempts at adaptation for the American audience over the years, but Netflix really has the best. Also, besides Netflix, Pili runs a YouTube account. One of their YouTubes is completely subtitled in English, this particular YouTube here. So you can have access to their stories with the subtitles from Pili themselves, and not having to have that translated through a Japanese media conglomerate and somebody else's opinion of what that story was supposed to be in the first place. So this is, a nice entry point for the pure Pili experience, to have access to Taiwanese glove puppetry, what that looks like, how those stories unfold. I think Netflix and YouTube are really kind of our entry point right now, and I would obviously suggest they're worth watching, that you should tell your friends about them, and that the more clicks Netflix and YouTube get, the better access we'll have to this in the future. If these aren't being watched by the American audience, then there's no reason for Netflix to keep bringing them in. There are some other puppetry companies in Taiwan that are trying to come into the American market, but we need to see some other Taiwanese success stories before those are given a space in the American market. So that was our kind of discussion today, a little history and kind of modern look into Taiwanese and Chinese glove puppetry, primarily focusing on Pili, War of Dragons, and the Thunderbolt Fantasy, which has the Japanese flair to it. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer those. Love to talk about it. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll thank you for attending and hope you learned something today.
Miss Debbie did put a question in the chat box.
Okay, so what was the name of the puppet show with the cockpit from the Muppets? The puppet show Cockpit aren't Muppets at all. That is from Supermationation. That's a British show, and that British show is Stingray. It's from 1960s. It's a show called Stingray. That's from the Gary Anderson Supermationation marionettes and rod puppets action from the United Kingdom. Gary Anderson Supermationation stories are still around. They no longer use marionettes because they have said for years that marionette work is too expensive, it's too hard, the CGI is cheaper and faster, and so a lot of the Supermationation stories have been moved to CGI movies, losing one art but adopting another. During COVID, and one of the weirdest things to come out of COVID, a few of the people that were working on some of the Supermationation CGI shows decided they just wanted to make a puppet show again, and so they started making a new puppet show, Nebula 75, directly for YouTube, and we're doing weekly installments on YouTube and making full Supermationation style show from their flat in London by themselves, just two friends just hanging out doing it. So I'm a huge fan of the Gary Anderson stuff, Supermationation. I presented about that a few years ago here for International Education Week, or part of the foreign film series. So yep, always watch for that to go around. Another question that came in on the chat window, now I've got my monitor switched back to that, is the earliest documented puppet show is going to be found either in India or China, depending on who you believe and what source you can vet. It is about the same age as drama in Greece, but puppetry doesn't enter Greece until nearly the Romans. They're sharing ideas because they already had live action theater. Ancient Greece did not pick up puppetry as a large piece of their world. But contemporary to the earliest thespians, it would be contemporary to the Indian and Hindi people. Glad I can remind you of your dad, kind of looking down through your puppet chatting in your chat window. Glad it looks like you learned a few things. Sure. Jeff, could you explain your question about China to make sure I answer it properly?
Yeah, you had indicated that the earliest documented puppetry shows were in Asia, specifically around the China area. From the documentation that you've seen, do you know what those shows were about?
I do. And so you've got to go back to what are the Greek plays about. Celebration is usually one of your main themes. History would also be a main theme. So regional history, somewhere in Xi'an, they'd be telling the story of the founding of Xi'an. Along the Silk Road in India, they'd be telling Urdu history and Pakistani history. So you've got a lot of history plays. You've got a lot of kind of celebratory sort of plays. And then also a lot of the religious plays, all the Buddhist kind of thoughts kind of swirled into it. So a lot of the same basic ideas and themes we see and understand from the Western idea of drama and the birth of drama, we're also watching in the first Chinese and Indian puppet plays. The Romans, as you probably know, being a history major yourself, Jeff, the Romans added a lot more fiction and a lot more fantasy elements to the theater world. They also had a lot more sex shows and a lot more bestiality, a lot more violence to Greek theater. And eventually the Chinese are going to wind up having some pieces of that in those shows as well. So you have some fairly wild storylines eventually that are documented and talked about as nice trivia pieces. But a lot of it winds up being the same basic ideas of any kind of literature. Who are we as a people? What story do we need to tell each other so we remember that story? And then what story do we tell travelers and people abroad so they know who we are? A lot of that same basic early literature movement is happening in those early Chinese, Taiwanese, Indian puppet shows. Yep. So thanks for those questions. Those are good questions. Anything else I can address and help you with? Before I lose my audience completely, I will plug there's a really good puppetry museum in Atlanta, Georgia, one of the world's spot that you feel comfortable moving around. If you're not able to go to China to look at Chinese puppetry, or to South Africa to look at South African puppetry, there's a really good puppet museum in Atlanta, Georgia, that is partially funded by the Jim Henson family. So lots of good Henson material, but also a really nice look at international puppetry, shadow puppetry, glove puppetry, marionettes, rod puppetry. There's a lot of history and variety to puppetry that you may have never thought about, and the museum is a great place to start exploring. So if you want to look at puppets, Atlanta's a good spot to go. That museum also has puppet shows most days, especially on the weekends, on the holidays, through the summer. You can go learn about puppets, see some exhibits about puppets, and then just sit down and watch a puppet show on a variety of topics. Sometimes it's an international topic, sometimes it's a retelling of the Rudolph story for Christmas, but just a nice time to go and learn more about puppetry. Visitors to that Atlanta museum often just kind of stop there with the show and the museum, but they also have one of the largest libraries of international puppet scripts anywhere in the world is in Atlanta. So if you do decide to delve into puppet literature and puppet scripts and puppet puppets in other ways, there's some really cool workshops and trainings that they can do, and some library pieces they can let you look into. Also, while I'm just promoting museums, because everybody needs to know about a good museum, Latrobe, Pennsylvania is the home of Mr. Rogers. There at St. Vincent's College, there is a museum dedicated to Mr. Rogers, and on display they have his original puppets from the show, which are sock or glove puppets. But also they have all of his scripts and all of his notes from the television series. So if you need to do a dive into Mr. Rogers' puppet scripts, there's a museum in Latrobe, Pennsylvania that's free and open to the public at the campus of St. Vincent's, which is a Catholic college there in Latrobe. St. Vincent's, some of you football fans may know, is the training camp for the Pittsburgh Steelers, because Latrobe is the birthplace of American football. That's where the first paid football team was Latrobe, Pennsylvania. And so the Steelers, of course, have their training camp there at St. Vincent's every year to celebrate the football history. And so you can, if you time it right, you can see some puppets and some good football. Go black and gold. Yep, Rolling Rock and Yingling are also both from that section of Pennsylvania, although neither one are actually made in Latrobe anymore. They've moved the breweries through some corporate acquisitions. They've moved those breweries out. But if you do go looking around Latrobe, you can still find some brewmasters for Yingling and some brewmasters from Rolling Rock. They'll give you some inside scoops about the history of those brands that may not be quite on the website.
Well, John, we appreciate the excellent presentation. That was extremely interesting. I definitely like the comparisons between ancient Greece, ancient Roman theater, and that of Asia. And I'm sure, Jeff, that John would definitely come to your class and be more than welcome to give a presentation to your History 111 students. So if there are no other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you all for attending. I hope you all learned anything. We did record this, so if you need and have any other questions, you certainly reach out to Mr. Withers, and I'm sure he'll be happy to answer those questions.
I'm always happy to answer questions, always happy to send resources about puppetry to anybody that needs a good puppet reference or a nice place to start looking for puppet information. I'm always love talking about that sort of thing. It doesn't come up very often in American literature classes. So if you have questions, please get in touch.
All right, so that concludes our presentation. Y'all have a great day.